in itself. So we're on page 3 in this iteration of the outline. Every year it shifts a little bit, so I add stuff and change stuff, take stuff out. And so on page 3 at the top, capital C, the content of their messages. They called people to return to the law of God. That's a constant thing. What did Isaiah say as he opens the book of Isaiah? He says, an ox knows its owner, and a donkey knows its master's manger, but Israel does not know. My people do not understand. Alas, sinful nation, people weighed down with iniquity. This is not some anti-Semite spewing nonsense on the internet. This is the prophet of Israel, sent by the God of Israel, to warn the people of Israel that they had wandered far from the law of God, which was for them Mosaic law. In each time period, in each dispensation of time, there has been one focus, one way for people to respond to God. During the time period here of Mosaic law, what was our rule of life? So here's a very important theological concept. In every period of time, how are people saved? The same way that Abraham was saved. Abraham believed God, and God accounted it to him as righteousness. There, in every dispensation of time, and this is a core teaching of a literal approach to the scripture. Don't let anyone in some fancy schmancy Presbyterian church tell you, oh, you dispensationalists believe that you can be saved by keeping the law. This is like what candidates do. They lie about the other guy. You know, when you receive campaign literature in the mail, it should be come with a warning. This page is dripping with lies. I love misrepresenting my opponent. I love taking black and white photos of him and making him look dangerous, whereas all of my photos are my smiling family. And and the makeup artist did a great job on us. So it's dishonest. It's intended to craft an image. So the image that you will hear is, oh, dispensationalists believe that you're saved by keeping the law. Never has anyone ever said that. You're always saved by faith in every time period. Once you come to faith, what then is what does God expect of you? What is your, and here's the phrase, what is your rule of life? Is simply a 3 words to simply put a handle on what does God expect of you. If you are Jewish and you're living in the time period of Mosaic law, you are saved only by faith. So in Israel, there were people who were saved and people who were not saved because they exercised no personal faith. They may have been very good at keeping the outward things of Mosaic law, but they were not saved because they had never personally exhibited personal faith. Once you exhibit personal faith, famous question of Francis Schaeffer, how then do we live? What is your rule of life? Well, if you are in the nation of Israel during the time period of Mosaic law, your rule of life is Mosaic law. By the way, during the time period that Jesus lived as a Jew, what was his rule of life? Mosaic law. That's why it is mistaken for a person now, after the cross, to say, well, how did Jesus do this? And I'm going to do it exactly the way he did. There are things in the everyday behavior of Jesus that are eternal principles that transcend all dispensations because they speak of the heart of God. Kindness, honesty, faith, all of these things transcend all the time periods. But Jesus is seen in Matthew chapter 9 wearing tzitzit. A woman reached out to touch the fringe of his garment because he was wearing tzitzit. And the rumor was, the superstition among the plain people was that if you touched the tzitzit of a very holy rabbi, you would be healed of a disease. She had a disease. She was looking to be healed. Jesus was wearing tzitzit because he was under Mosaic law. Jesus wore a talis, as we say in Yiddish. That doesn't mean that we have to do the same thing. He was under the law. When he gave his life, he paid the penalty for sin. We're no longer under law, we're under grace. So you can't follow that phrase blindly, because it will lead you in the direction of Mosaic law observance. Again, the law is good, holy, and just, but the work of the Messiah is better, as the book of Hebrews very clearly teaches. So back to the top of page 3 in your outline, the content of their messages. You see 10 things there that are offered. Our dear doctor has given us these 10. I picked these 10 out of 611 that he had. Back in the early days of camp, he had these gigantic lists, and we would look at each other as we perspired in the heat in the old building. Does he really expect us to memorize all, 600 of these? And so eventually he took pity on us and he boiled them down to these 10. So this is the content of their messages. Again, we're not going to detail those, but they called people to obey Mosaic law, called people for social justice. They were preaching against social injustice. I am a conservative, but you need to recognize, all of us fellow conservatives need to recognize that social injustice, social inequity is an important matter to the heart of God. Amos spent a lot of time preaching about social inequity, about the rich being able to exploit their wealth to oppress the poor. That happens. It doesn't happen to the extent that one political party says it does, but it still does happen. And we need to hold a balanced view. Again, you can ambush me outside. I tend to be a moderate on some of those things. There are predictions of immediate future judgments. There is messianic prophecy, predictions of the great tribulation and the coming messianic kingdom. All important things. So we go on in our outline, and the southern kingdom of Judah, we'll go back here for a moment. The southern kingdom of Judah, there in that orange sort of color, they lasted until 586. Ultimately, the Babylonians came and destroyed Jerusalem. The first destruction of Jerusalem was in 586. There were, before that first destruction of 586, you see from this chart here on the PowerPoint, you see that there was first a deportation in 606. This is when the Babylonians carried away the first group of young Jewish men in order to put them to work in Babylon. This was the deportation of the hoi polloi. That's not the official name, but these were the young, smart people who had skills in mathematics, in the sciences. Daniel, the 3 young men were carried away because they were educated, they were healthy, and they could make a contribution to the Babylonian society. No, they weren't carried away as slaves, they were carried away as basically visa workers to add to the Babylonian economy. There are other deportations. Finally, in 586, the temple is destroyed. Famous phrase is the 70 years of captivity. Again, that's detailed in other courses here at Camp Shoshanah. When Arnold teaches Daniel, he talks about the fact that in Daniel chapter 9, Daniel lifts up his voice in prayer. He's in captivity in Babylon. By the rivers of Babylon we wept when we remembered Zion. Okay, so they would remember the glories of the temple, and they would weep as on their one day off when they played the harps and sang the songs of Zion, and tried to teach their children a little bit of Judaica there. So here in Daniel chapter 9, Daniel is praying. He says, how long will it be until we are released? And the answer comes back to him, 70 years are decreed. There are two ways to compute the 70 years. Not getting into a long ganze Geschichte here, but you can compute the 70 years either from the first deportation to the return under Zerubbabel. So from 606 to 536, 70 years. The alternative and more popular method is to say that the 70 years are from the destruction of the temple there in Jerusalem until the second temple is completed. Either way, you have 70 years, so the 70-year time period for captivity that Daniel prayed about, that 70 years will work with either of these. It just shifts over 20 years. During the exile in Babylon, Jews are allowed limited rights. They weren't slaves in Babylon. They were involuntary servants. They worked 6 days a week. By the way, they were able to establish communities. They had children. They had a day off. They could farm small plots of land where they lived and grow their own vegetables, in addition to their obligation for work. Understand that Judaism as constructed, and here is a major concept for you to grasp. Judaism as constructed under Mosaic law was specific to one location. During the time when the tabernacle wandered around the wilderness, you had to be at the tabernacle because you had to offer sacrifice. Because if you didn't offer sacrifice, you were out of right relationship with God. Once the tabernacle came to Jerusalem and the first temple was built under Solomon, God said, Jerusalem is the place where I have placed my name. If you look at the hills of Jerusalem, you see the letter Shin as a relief there. The hills of Jerusalem form the letter Shin. Letter Shin is the first letter of the word Shaddai, because we worship El Shaddai. I have placed my name there, literally. And so Judaism was tied, it was anchored to one locality. It was tied to Jerusalem. That's why building the high places in the northern kingdom did not work. It was prohibited. It was asur. You could not do that. And that's why they fell first. And so, what are you going to do? You're in captivity. You're in Babylon. The temple is destroyed. Should we abandon Judaism because we have no place to sacrifice? Should we abandon Judaism because we're now in captivity? The answer was, we need to reinvent Judaism. We will not give up on the goal of returning to the land and rebuilding the Holy Temple. We're going to do that, but in the meantime, we're having children. Let's teach our children what we're going to do when we get back to Israel. Let's teach them that why we don't worship the gods that they see in the streets of Babylon. Why don't we worship those gods? Because we believe only in HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We only believe in the Holy One, blessed be He. And so they want to teach their children. So let's start a school to teach the children. Sounds like a great idea. Let's have a little Bible school for the little kids. And then we need to teach the teenagers too. So we're going to have a school and it's going to get bigger and bigger. Oh, we just got permission from the Babylonians to put up a building for our school because we have like 300 students now. And let's have a prayer service in the building. Sounds like a good idea. You've just invented the synagogue. You've just invented the synagogue. There was no synagogue before this. Why? Because there was a temple. Now, certainly there were houses of study, but in a kind of loose form. Now you have the formal institution of the synagogue. So we say here, Jewish communities establish houses of study. Those became houses of prayer. Beit Tefillah, they became houses of prayer, houses of study, houses of prayer. That is the birth of the rabbinical system. You have no rabbis before the captivity in Babylon. The priesthood, tribe of Levi, was responsible for telling people the law. There were prophets, certainly God appointed prophets, but they were not organized as a class. Now in Babylon, with the limited rights that they have, they were able to train teachers of Judaism. So this new class of people, the rabbis, are trained and appointed to keep Judaism going forward until they could go back to the land of Israel. So here's the main point. Judaism is no longer tied geographically to Israel. It is now portable. You can take it wherever you are. And this becomes the genius of the Jewish people, because they're not limited. Up until this time period, every major pagan religion was tied to a shrine. Now, Judaism is not a pagan religion, it's the religion of the Creator, but at the same time, they recognized that, as the Psalms say, that it poses the question, is he the God of Israel only? No, he's not the God of Israel only, but he is the God who is over Kol Haaretz. He's over all the earth. Kol Goyim. Give praise to our God. All the nations, give praise to our God. That's why the Psalms, written during the time of King David, called to the nations, the Gentile nations, to abandon their fake gods and take up the worship of the God of Abraham. Judaism is not a local religion. Here's an example. I often make speaking trips from my home in North Jersey into Pennsylvania, upstate New York, Yenneville, various places I go. And when I start to drive, I typically have my car radio tuned to the New York City news station. I live around 40 miles west of New York City. So as I drive west toward central Pennsylvania, that station fades. And eventually, by the time I cross the Delaware River, I've got I used to have to turn the dial. Now it's just a button, it's all digital. So I look for another station. And they don't have many news stations west of the Delaware, so I wind up listening to what baby boomers listen to, old top 40 radio. And so I have to pick up a different station. Why? Because the New York station is limited in its geography. It's limited in power. Its signal hovers over the New York area. When I go to central Pennsylvania, I've got to pick up a station from Lancaster or Harrisburg, because their power hovers over that area. In the same way, in the ancient world, they imagined that gods were local and regional. When in Babylon, the god of Babylon had power. That's why you worship the god of Babylon. But the god of Babylon had no power in Assyria. So if you happen to move to Assyria, guess what? You got a new set of idols, because your old idols didn't work. The old idols you had from Babylon would not work in Assyria. People who move from a country that has 110 volt, and now they move to a country that has 220 volt, they have to get a whole new set of appliances, because those adapters will work for 2 weeks, then you're going to burn out all your appliances. You've got to get a new set. For the psalmist to say, all of the gods of the peoples are idols, but Jehovah made the heavens and earth, was not politically correct. Because the politically correct thing was to say, oh, you're in Assyria, you have wonderful gods. Oh, you're in Babylon, what beautiful idols you guys have. That's what you had to say to be politically correct in those days. Because the idols of Babylon only worked in Babylon, the idols of Assyria only worked in Assyria. But the Jewish people are saying, Narishkeit. Well, that's a Yiddish word, so they didn't say narrow, they said foolishness. There is only one true God, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Holy One, blessed be He, and He is king over all the earth. And so that's the main point. Judaism is no longer tied to Israel. It's now a portable faith. It will go wherever they can carry a Torah scroll. When Jewish people slept from one place to another permanently, they had Torah scrolls. One of the most dramatic photos is one that you see. It was a staged photo, but it was a recreation. When Jews were forced to leave Baghdad in the 1940s, Jewish community, by the way, the Jewish community in Baghdad, Iraq, they once owned 1/3 of Baghdad. It was a very large, very powerful, well-to-do, well-educated, influential community. As soon as the strife between the Jewish people and the local Arab population in Israel, when that started to heat up, the Jews were persecuted and there were massacres of Jews in Baghdad. People who had lived there for 2,500 years were massacred by their Arab neighbors who took their property. And so there were these large-scale events where Jews were literally walking toward Israel. Eventually they were picked up by trucks, but there are these dramatic photos of what were they carrying at the very front of the line? They were carrying big Torah scrolls. They had these big Sephardic Torah scrolls that are round in the hard case. The community was leaving, they were moving. And what's in the front of the procession? Torah scrolls. And so Judaism is no longer tied geographically to Israel. It is now portable. Eventually, the 70 years comes to a conclusion. Babylon is conquered by the Medes and Persians under Cyrus the Great. That's foretold in Scripture, in Isaiah. 536 is the first return from Babylon to Israel under Zerubbabel. Second temple construction begins. By 516, the second temple is completed. It was half the size of the first. Here's an important point. And I know we're running through the outline because we have to talk much more about post-biblical Jewish history. Many Jewish people chose to stay in Persia and in Babylon. Many Jewish people chose to stay there. Why? Because the synagogue system had been established. Look at your notes there under Roman numeral 9. You see that there are the beginnings of the synagogue, the beginnings of rabbinical authority. Number 10, Roman numeral 10, the return from exile. There is now a large synagogue system set up in Babylon. When the Medes and Persians came in, they said, hey, we're nice guys. We're not going to, if you thought you had some freedom under the Babylonians, you're going to love living under the Medes and Persians. Please don't leave. You don't have, if you want to leave, you can go back. But it's not nice where you left. 70 years, everything is broken down. You're going to have to start from scratch. You've got nothing here, there. You've got nothing in Israel. Here in this beautiful neighborhood of Susa, you've got these beautiful houses. You have your synagogue. You have these beautiful buildings. Why leave? Amongst the people who chose not to leave were two people by the name of Mordechai and Esther. Yay. I'm partial to Mordechai because that's my Hebrew name. And they chose to stay in the old Babylon, the new Persia, because there were these houses of study, the communities were established, and so you had a whole synagogue system there. So in essence, this becomes the start of the synagogue system. It becomes the start of what is called Diaspora Judaism. Very important phrase. I don't see it here in my notes that I handed to you, but the word diaspora, D-I-A-S-P-O-R-A, check that spelling, it may be Brooklyn, but diaspora means the dispersion. Jewish people are now becoming dispersed over different parts of the world, and they're holding on to their identity. They held on to their identity during 70 years of captivity in Babylon. How did they do it? By having separate schools, by having a language, by having an alphabet, by teaching their kids. Oftentimes, in many communities, many diaspora communities in the ancient world in which Jews lived, the highest rates of literacy in the population was found among the Jewish population. Why? Because they established houses of study for the children, and the children went to Beit Sefer, and they learned in those schools. And so many Jewish people stayed behind Persia and Babylon. Houses of study, oh, there's the word diaspora on the PowerPoint there. Both in the diaspora, eventually in Israel, you have this rising diaspora system. So in essence, you have three centers of Judaism. So here, going from east to west, the Jewish people were there in Babylon. Some people come back to Israel, but now down here in Egypt, you also have a Jewish population center. So along with Babylon, which becomes one population center, for 2,500 years, the Jewish population of Babylon was one of the most stable in the world. The whole Babylonian Talmud, the Gemara section of Talmud, was written there in Babylon. Israel, of course, but Israel was up and down depending on who was ruling over it. And then, of course, down in Egypt. And there were large centers of Jewish life down into Egypt, so much that they actually built a false temple in the city of Elephantine down in Egypt. So that's where we will pick up tomorrow with Roman numeral 11 as we talk about your friend and mine, Alexander the Great. See you then.